This is UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. Spring is coming and the stores are full of red hearts and candy. What does science have to tell us about how we fall in love and with whom? What makes us swipe left or right? And does that have anything to do with successful relationships? Joining us to discuss these questions and more are two psychologists who study attraction and attachment. Paul Eastwick is a professor of psychology and runs the Attraction and Relationships Research Laboratory at UC Davis. He investigates how people initiate romantic relationships and the psychological mechanisms that keep couples happy and committed to each other. And Karen Bales is professor of psychology at UC Davis as well, and core scientist in the Neuroscience and Behavior Unit at the California National Primate Research Center. She studies the neurobiology of pair bonding and biparental care in prairie voles and titi monkeys, species that form lasting monogamous bonds. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
So I want to remind our viewers that we are taking your questions. If you're watching us live, just leave questions in the comment section and we'll get to them, get to as many as we can during the time that we have. So Paul, let's start with you. What can science tell us about human relationships?
It can tell us quite a bit. It can really help us to identify what are the strongest, most robust predictors of what makes a relationship go well and what makes a relationship go poorly. I think a scientific lens to this question can also encourage us to have a little bit of humility when it comes to just how predictable relationships are. Specifically, it can encourage us to at least be a little bit more circumspect about our strong conclusions that we know exactly where things like compatibility and other important aspects of relationships come from.
Right. And Karen, you study pair bonding in prairie voles and titi monkeys, as I mentioned. What's special about these particular animals?
Well, what's special about them is that they form pair bonds. So that only happens in about 3 to 5% of mammals. Most mammals as adults don't form these really strong selective attachments to one other adult. I also work with seahorses too, by the way, which also form pair bonds.
Oh, that's interesting. So in what ways can your research with these animals inform what we know about human relationships?
Right. Well, one of the things that we're missing in our ability to study human relationships is control, experimental control. So, for instance, I always say the day that UC Davis lets me put 2 undergrads in a room together and tell them to form a pair bond, then I won't need to study animals anymore. But they don't let me do that.
Right. I wonder why. Yeah.
And, of course, with, for instance, the rodent models, we are able to do more invasive procedures in which we can manipulate hormones and various other things in the brain.
Paul, you've done a lot of research on how people pick potential partners. What have you found?
So one thing we've tried to do in our studies, so it's true, right? Humans naturally are engaging in a bit more free choice when it comes to the way that they go about selecting partners. They might have more options that they're considering at any given moment in time. And so one thing that we want to try to get a handle on is what are the different factors that cause a person to choose this person to date rather than these other potential partners that they have also met, but they shaded in one direction rather than another. What we've been able to identify are important individual differences related to who is going to be especially popular, for example, or who is going to be especially selective, right? There are some people that really will wait for a while until they meet the right person before they want to date that person. But often what we want to try to predict is compatibility in these sorts of situations, where people have a lot of free choice. There's many people they could potentially date. And that compatibility element ends up being extremely hard to predict from the various individual factors that people might report about themselves ahead of time. So the people that are really going to click, it's not usually that they have similar personalities or even that, they have a similar interest in classic rock or French movies. Predicting who are the particular pairs that are going to fit very well together ends up being an immense challenge.
Right. So you're saying that people who meet people have in their minds maybe their ideal partner, Okay. But what you're saying is you have found that the reality is what they think they want and what actually would work for them aren't necessarily the same thing.
That's right. When you are initially introducing a number of people to each other, the extent to which these people match what you said you were looking for ahead of time really doesn't do much of anything in terms of predicting how much you're going to like that person. Yeah, if that person is popular and has a lot of great traits, you're going to be into them. And if you're popular and you have a lot of great traits, like that's great for you. I'm happy for you. And lots of people are going to want to date you. But it's that compatibility component. This person really matches what you uniquely were looking for. That's the part that's especially hard.
Right. I mean, Karen, do you find, I know you don't have quite the same kind of insight into your subjects in your research, but does anything in your research does that kind of jive with what you're finding in animals?
Well, so you're right. The animals can't verbally tell us who they like, but we actually we collaborate with Paul, and we have a common grad student, Alexander Baxter, who's been using these relational models in our titi monkeys. So doing when we've needed to set up new pairs, he has a speed dating paradigm that he
For the
puts them
monkeys.
through for the monkeys.
Okay.
Where each animal gets 3 choices, and then he's used Paul's relational model to pick who should be paired with who. And in fact, those pairs that we picked those ways engage in more affiliative behavior than pairs that we did not give the choice to.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. I just want to remind people who are watching that we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. If you have relationship questions, maybe you had an experience that you didn't understand what happened, or, just let us know. We might be able to, apply some of the findings that we've learned through our scientific research here. So, when 2 people go out on a date and then maybe there's an initial attraction, Paul, what determines whether, nothing comes of it? Maybe it's just a short-term relationship, or it blooms into a long-term relationship. Have we figured out is there a magic formula that leads to a long-term committed relationship?
Yeah. I mean, it would be great if there were, right? I mean, it would be great even if there were reliable indicators early on of where this thing is going. And I think there's a classic idea that's been around for a long time. If you want to hook up with somebody, go to these bars here. But if you want to meet your husband or your wife, right, you should be hunting over here for a potential partner. And this sort of hookup long-term relationship bifurcation model, where people do one thing for one kind of relationship and another thing for another kind of relationship, this ends up being not terribly useful when people are going through that search process. I think it's very useful for people when they're reflecting back on relationships that they've had to say, those guys were the hookups, and then this one got serious. But to try to do that in any kind of prospective way ends up being pretty difficult. What that means in practice, people's subjective experience as they're forming relationships, is that they spend a lot of time not really knowing where this thing is going, right? It's a lot of compatibility building, or at least attempts at building compatibility along the way. Sometimes you hit stumbling blocks. The sexual chemistry isn't really there. You end up fighting about what seem to be silly things, and so you decide to break it off. But this is usually what people have to go through as they try to figure out, what is this thing going to be? And there really aren't any good shortcuts to get to that endpoint.
Right. So you talk about the long-term relationships. It's a process of building compatibility. So how do people go about doing that? Are there certain practices in a relationship that people can follow, or are they just kind of need to make it up on their own because the 2 individual people they're just individuals, and you can't really, say anything that applies to everyone?
Yeah. I mean, there are certainly, what relationship science has done well is it has identified sort of average, whether styles of conflict or styles of support, that are going to be associated with having happier relationships on average, right? These are sort of techniques that have been around for a very long time. People say, you sort of reflect back what you hear your partner saying, or try to validate them, right? Show that you understand their experience. Don't engage in a lot of, contemptuous eye rolling behaviors, right? These things are not going to go especially well. So now, but it's very easy to sort of give a menu of like, here's how to fight. Do these things, not these things. You'll be in good shape. But the reality is, figuring out how you sort of structure the nature of your sort of intertwined goals and needs and like the things you have to get through in your daily life with another person is really, really challenging. That's a lot of the compatibility building for which there is no real recipe book, because everybody's sort of suite of needs and goals in a particular moment ends up being pretty unique. So, there are certainly sort of broad lessons that we can give people about sort of how to make their relationships better. But much of the hard work of figuring out how you're going to intertwine your life with somebody else ends up being something you kind of have to feel your way through.
Karen, what would you say is something that has come out of your research that people would find surprising?
Oh, goodness.
Or something that you found surprising that you didn't expect that the findings would be that?
Well, one thing that we've studied has been the effects of intranasal oxytocin exposure during development and how that can affect long-term pair bonding. So the idea is basically that this is a hormone that's involved in pair bonding. And about 10 years ago, people started using it as a treatment for conditions in which there are social aspects to the condition, like autism. And we were really worried that there could be long-term side effects. So we did animal models and found that there are long-term side effects, and some of them are not desirable. So, for instance, it can increase anxiety to be exposed repeatedly to the love hormone.
And this is at what point of life in life? You're talking developmental, so you're talking when they're children, or
well, so the closest it's sort of like the adolescent period that we were exposing them to the hormone, and then we were testing them during that period while they were getting exposed, and then as adults as well. So
and you're talking about being exposed to not oxytocin produced by the body, but introduced externally.
Exactly.
Like additional okay.
Exactly. So I think some people get surprised by the idea that the love hormone can cause negative things in our relationships and in our psychology.
Right. Paul, what about you? Were there any kind of findings that you found surprising, or that people, when you told them about them, they were surprised by what you found?
That's a good question. I think one of the findings that I continue to find, I don't know if surprising is quite the right word, but at least like mysterious, it's the mystery that we want to continue getting to the heart of, is what happens to popularity over time, right? So I mentioned earlier, in these speed dating scenarios, we can identify pretty easily who the popular people are and who the popular people are not. But a funny thing starts to happen as people get to know each other better over time, when you're not talking about initial impressions anymore, but you're talking about sort of a longer period of acquaintance. And what starts to happen is that the popularity starts to wear off, right? It's like a drug initially, right? Mm-hmm. Some people have it, some people don't. And like, it really matters. But as people get to know each other better, yeah, there's still some differences in popularity. Some people are more desirable than others, but it starts to matter less. And what this suggests is that as people get to know each other, they start to create much more idiosyncratic impressions of each other's desirability. So I see the desirability in this person, whereas other people aren't seeing it so much. So with time, this sort of, we talk about it like sort of mate value becoming ephemeral, right? That's sort of a technical way of describing this, but when people's desirability is wearing off, what that does is it gives you a chance to have a model of human relationships that is based more on compatibility. Everybody kind of has a better chance of hitting it off with somebody if everybody's not just competing for the most desirable people. So this is one thing that we want to try to explore in greater detail because it has all sorts of interesting implications, right? What it suggests is that in environments where people just get to know each other over time, that actually the longer people spend in that period, the less competitive it should be, right? People should calm down in their sort of, mating relevant competition behaviors as they get to know each other better, because they're not all fighting over the same 3 people anymore. So these are sort of some of the mysteries that we want to try to unpack in greater detail.
So it almost sounds like, everybody has their 15 minutes of fame, but once that fades, if you don't have the compatibility kind of figured out, then it's probably not going to work out.
Right. And it tells you something about the strategies you should use too. Like if you're a really desirable person, like, you got 15 minutes, like make it count. But if you're not, like, don't worry, just like hang in there, hour 2, hour 3, maybe day 4, day 5, like things are going to start to improve for you. So it sort of has implications too for how people navigate this arenas.
Right. Lawrence, who's watching on YouTube, asks, for folks that have chemistry but may seem incompatible due to factors like family, religion, etc., seem to face uphill battles. Is there a societal aspect to compatibility in these studies?
That's a really good question, and one of the challenges is, as sort of Karen alluded to earlier, what I don't get to do in my studies is introduce a whole lot of people who come from very incompatible backgrounds, as the listener's describing, right? So the kinds of tests you'd want to do to see what kinds of chemistry can overcome incompatible backgrounds like that, that is also very tricky research to do. I am not a relationship therapist in any way, shape, or form, but I do know that relationship therapists generally treat these sorts of things like structural issues that can be dug down to in more detail. So this relationship will be disappointing to your parents. Why do you think that? Let's unpack that some more. What is really the core of this issue here, right? They would start asking questions like this to dig in more detail. That starts to get away from the scientific perspective and more into the practitioner perspective. But I agree these questions are pretty fascinating, and I wish that the science had more to say about it.
Ryan, who's watching on Facebook, asks, do you believe in one true love, or are there a bunch of matches for any given person? Paul, let's start with you.
Okay. No, and I'll even go further and say, not only is there not one true love, but if I could wipe your mind and have you live your life again, and even have you meet your quote unquote one true love now, you might not hit it off again in the same way. And so sorry if that's kind of a buzzkill, but the logic here is that it is very easy to underappreciate the extent to which sort of situational factors and chance factors matter in helping us to build a good relationship. So your good relationship now is not an illusion. That is a real thing. But something that looks like it was destined to be this way was likely created by many chance events that would be really hard to sort of unwind and redo again from the beginning. So yeah, that's that's how I would come at that question.
There's so many factors that go into it. There's physical attraction, there's timing, there's circumstance, there's context, there's just like, maybe one person both those people were feeling particularly good that day, and it just happened to, so it just seems like very unpredictable. Karen, what have you found, anything along those lines as far as answering the question to one true love, or, with these monogamous animals that you're studying?
Well, I wouldn't say that they have one true love in the sense that, we can put any male prairie vole with any female prairie vole, and they'll usually get along. But in the wild, these are actually really well-studied animals. And if a male or female adult loses their mate, they almost never find a new mate. So maybe they were compatible with lots of animals to begin with, but it does seem like that whoever they find becomes their one true love.
Okay. Kristen, who's watching on YouTube, asks, do you have any advice, thoughts, or know of research focused on romantic partners with different or incompatible love languages? For example, one likes words of affirmation, but the other is not comfortable or used to expressing feelings verbally.
I would not get too hung up on compatibility around any particular love language or any other communication style. So scientifically, there's really no evidence that these things are even things. What I would say is that there are lots of nice things that you can do to communicate with partners. And sometimes it's expressing affection, and sometimes it's giving gifts, and sometimes it's doing things for them, right? There's all kinds of very, tangible support, invisible support. These things tend to be good for relationships. That two people are incompatible by their nature in the kinds of affection they want. There is, I cannot overemphasize how little evidence there is for that idea. And so what that means is that all of these differences and the kinds of things you want your partner to do can be worked out and changed to make your relationship better. So if what you want your partner to do, what would be good for you in these moments is to have them do, this kind of support rather than that kind of support. That's the kind of thing that you work out together. And that tends to be how good relationships work. It's not about putting people who have compatible or, avoiding incompatible matches and those kinds of desired support styles.
Okay. So, what makes a good match? I'm sure this is a question that people, have been wondering about forever. I don't know. I mean, Karen, do you want to start with maybe trying to answer that question? What you found during your research?
Sure. So, we've tried over and over to predict who will be a good match. And the best thing we found so far actually is choice, giving the animals choice. But as far as afterwards, what characteristics characterize a good pair, we like to see lots of affiliation. We like to see, the same levels of interest in various things. So just to give an example, we have a test where the pair sees themselves in a mirror and they don't recognize themselves, right? They think it's a strange pair. And we see that in good pairs, they have the same level of response. They sort of mirror each other's behaviors in their response to an intruder. And of course, we prefer pairs that, fight less with each other, disagree less on things. But, it's funny, the question you were asking earlier about love language and how you want your partner to behave. And we've often seen overtly animals just telling their partner that they don't like what they're doing. So, for instance, in this test, we've seen males get really worked up to hear these strange animals and, trying to restrain the female. And we've seen females then just get, stop it. Mm-hmm. And jump. We had one female just jump on the male's back and kind of squish him and be like, no. So they all have their own ways of communicating with each other, of course, but we like to see it when they're kind of on the same page.
That's interesting.
I'll add too, those are all some of the best parallels to human relationships, because really it's many of those same factors, right? Those factors that describe the sort of high functioning titi monkey pair bonds or prairie vole pair bonds are often going to have analogs in what is going to make for a high functioning human pair bond. And the idea that couples have to work it out to make it good along the way. And if they don't work it out, then that ends up being a particularly bad bond. But, relationships research really suggests that, whereas some people are going to be popular initially and others are not, most people have the ability to be a really good long-term partner or a really bad long-term partner. And it really depends on how you navigate some of those things that Dr. Bales was just describing.
Right, right. And you've spoken about the breaking those good and bad partners as cads and dads, because usually it's the male for some reason.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there are sort of a whole wide variety of perspectives that suggest that that men in particular come in types, right? That essentially the logic is that men, by virtue of the fact that they may not need to have invested in offspring as much in ancestral context as women, you can get these different strategies that evolve in males. And some of those strategies can be very low investment, sexy strategies. Those are the cads. And some of those strategies can be very high investment, good dude kind of strategies. And those are the dads, right? And so there is some evidence for this idea. My perspective is that there's plenty of evidence that there are cads out there, people who are initially desirable, but maybe up to no good. But again, it's the dad part that's actually the most perplexing, but also I think the most interesting. The idea that many cads will end up one day becoming perfectly fine dads, and many good dads will actually get in a relationship where they're not good long-term partners at all, and they'll do better in a subsequent good relationship. So there is, you see more variability relationship to relationship in humans than perhaps you see in some other pair bonding species. I don't know, the extent to which those things are exactly comparable, but that would be my guess for what you see in humans.
Karen, have you studied anything along those lines in the animals you study?
Well, with prairie voles in the wild, actually, there's a subset of males that don't settle down and form a monogamous pair, and that live their lives wandering and trying to get extra pair copulations with females who have a mate already. And so, whereas the ones that settle down on their own nest do help raise the babies. So I would say actually in the wild, prairie voles do have a very striking set of cads and dads, and there's a neurobiology behind that that's been studied.
So Karen, with your research, I would imagine that you must have maybe friends who ask you for relationship advice, or like, what have you found that we can apply to our human relationships? If someone were to ask you, like, for just general relationship advice about how to have a successful relationship, how to meet someone, and what would you say?
Wow. I usually say, well, if you were a titi monkey, this is what you would do. But I think actually in thinking about human relationships, and titi monkey and prairie vole relationships, I usually just come back to thinking about relationships from an attachment perspective, and that they involve both the preference for the partner as well as distress upon separation and the ability of the partner to buffer you against other stressors. And so I like to think of relationships in that kind of holistic way, and also that if you're not getting that, if you don't care when the person's not around, and if they stress you out worse than whatever else is out there to stress you out, then that's probably not a good relationship. So that's sort of the way I think about it. But as far as finding somebody, I don't. TD monkeys don't use dating apps or anything.
Right. That's a whole other thing. Yeah, exactly. Before I ask you, Paul, before I have a question from from Claire, who's watching on Facebook, who writes, "I know who I like does not always make sense. Have researchers been able to distinguish differences between individuals who tend to alpha others versus people that tend to serial date? It does not seem like I want to target a particular male that I end up liking for reasons that may not be compatible, but I tend to naturally. Do people generally feel as though they grow more intelligent in relationship ideas, or do people tend to let go more? For example, as they might come to more accustomed to forming relationships. I think I tend to alpha male those that I end up liking, in contrast to my mind's tendency. It seems like serial daters seem to let go more and move on faster and often. It's a lot there, but
yeah, one of the interesting threads in this question gets to the heart of what does it take for somebody to commit to this one particular person versus sort of wanting to see what other possibilities are out there. And this is really one of the grand challenges that people confront when it comes to any sort of relationship formation process, is this idea like, well, what if there are others out there? And the funny thing is, I think for most people, I don't want to speak for everybody, and so this may not actually really address the listener's question very well, other than to point out most people stop looking when they're so into the person that they're forming a relationship with that everything else out there just starts to look pretty dull and uninteresting. And so that's sort of like this, we call it derogation of alternatives, but the idea is like,
sounds like settling.
Yeah, but that's the great part, is that it doesn't feel that way. And everybody else might think you're settling, but it's not how it feels to you. And like, that's the magic of the thing. I mean, that's the like pair bond formation at its finest, is like, boy, you feel like you hit the lottery, and everybody else is like, you can do better. So for somebody who like isn't feeling that, again, I wish I had a shortcut. I wish I had a way of, because what I sort of hear in this question is like, I'd like to sort of stick to one person, but I have a hard time doing it. And there really is no secret to sort of getting those blinders. Usually it just kind of happens to people when they feel sufficiently interested in somebody else.
Karen, any advice on that front from the animal kingdom?
Not at all.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But the titis, right? I mean, it doesn't take them long before like, it's like this person and everybody else is a threat, right?
It's definitely quicker in prairie voles. Actually, in prairie voles, it takes about a day, and titi monkeys, 4 to 6 months actually before. And then what we see actually is that they get very hostile towards animals that are not their pair mate. So fair enough, yeah.
So
right.
Paul,
that's like, right, when you start dating somebody, the two of you go to parties together and it's nice, but after 4 to 6 months, like you can't take them out anymore because
yeah, exactly. So Paul, what kind of advice do you have for people who say that they have a hard time finding a partner, all the good ones are taken, just can't find anyone who's going to be a long-term partner for me?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, people's heartbreak and frustration along these lines is very real. And Valentine's Day is for a lot of people a reminder of that, right? It's Valentine's Day, it creates a lot of pressure on some people, and it sort of is a reminder of sort of feeling like something's missing for a lot of people too. So yeah, so this time can be challenging for a lot of people. The sorts, one way of thinking about the challenges of sort of feeling like there are no romantic options out there, or you can't find them, is to actually treat it a little bit like a loneliness problem, right? So let's just like take it out of the romantic realm for a second. What kind of advice would you give to people who are feeling lonely, right? And so there are different things that can work, that can help people sort of alleviate feelings of loneliness. Some of it has to do with the thoughts that people have about expectations that they'll be rejected if they make this kind of advance or that kind of advance, sort of challenging some of those sort of threatening, upsetting thoughts that people have. And sometimes it's as simple as a change of scenery. This is sort of an anecdote from anthropological work, but I kind of love it. And these are researchers who study groups, sort of small living groups who in South America who are living sort of a more a subsistence kind of living, and they often will have to move from group to group. And that's often what they see the young people doing. So if there's too many, it can easily happen that there's sort of too many men around in this group, right? And so many of the men are unpartnered. They go off to new groups. They go to those new groups, and then they meet new people, and they sort of start again. So that's a thing that humans do that's actually kind of remarkable, is the ability to sort of shift into new groups and new social situations and adapt and like create this new social reality for yourself. It can be a hard thing to do, but sometimes that's what people need, is kind of like a social reboot. And again, you think about it, like take it out of the romantic realm, like make it about the broader sort of loneliness, social connection question. And I find that sort of helps people sort of see different avenues than if it's about like what app do I need to get on?
Right. And it also kind of speaks a little bit to the whole concept of like an arranged marriage or an arranged pairing. People in Western society, for the most part, feel like I'm going to find my own partner. It's going to be love. In other societies, families get together and they like pair people up, and they're like, you're going to learn to love that person.
Right. And humans are remarkable because we can get by in all of these kinds of social structures, right? We can adapt to the like, hey, time to move, like get ready to go meet a whole bunch of new people that you've never met before. And we can also deal with the like, well, these families have been kind of trading mates for a long time. And so, you got two choices. Let's talk about it.
Let's see. Tula from YouTube asks, what is the best age to start a long-term relationship? And how do you know if the other person is ready for one or will become ready for one?
I mean, okay, depends on what you mean by long-term relationship. There is plenty of evidence suggesting that people who get married later those marriages are more likely to last. That's probably not really about age per se. It could very easily be about socioeconomic status. So I would not like take actionable advice from those studies, but I at least did want to mention that, like that fact is out there and it's pretty clear. People seem to want to be in a long-term relationship when they meet somebody that they just can't really imagine being apart from. I mean, Karen was talking about some of these factors earlier, right? That a person who, when they're around, they make you feel less stressed, not more stressed. Somebody who, when they're around, like you want to be around them more, not, you want to spend your time running away from that person. So usually when people start having those experiences, there's a good bet that this is the kind of person that you seem to be forming a bond with. That really isn't, that can happen, really at any age, post-puberty, those sorts of feelings can really start to happen at any time.
Mm-hmm. Karen, have you found any kind of evidence that in the animals that you study that, pairings that happen at a certain age have a better chance of lasting?
Well, we haven't systematically studied that. So this is more like anecdata. But I think sometimes when the titi monkeys are really young, when you put them together, the pairings are a bit less successful. And on the flip side, if you have a monkey who is, maybe has been around for a bit, we've had to repair because they haven't gotten along with someone else, then those are also going to be less successful pairings. But there's the obvious confound there that they seem to be, difficult to get along with anyway. But so there seems to be that sweet spot where, you're fully adult, but you haven't had a chance to pick up bad habits.
So, before we wrap up, do you have any kind of, closing thoughts for as we are approaching Valentine's Day? For people who maybe want to look at their relationships in a different way, or, for people who are not in a relationship, anything that maybe your research can tell us as we go into this holiday. I mean, Karen, if you want to start, I guess.
Oh man, why don't I let Paul start?
Okay.
On that one?
Well, I think in sort of happy, high functioning relationships, we often see a lot that what people do well is they sort of create a system, a dyadic system that is working, right? Ways of sort of operating within that relationship that give you a sense of intimacy, but also, you're helping each other to meet various goals. Now, the trap is that that's a great way to create a lot of routines and to not notice when those routines aren't going as well, aren't working as the way that they used to. And so, it's always good to take a moment now and again to ask yourselves, is this structure working for us the way that it used to? Are there some things that we could change up? And what could we be doing that's new that could add something that would be worth trying? And there's certainly evidence in the literature that when people are trying new and exciting things together, that usually does give a real boost, a real lift to their bond. So anyway, it's worth thinking about in your relationship that important tension between sort of creating a structure and patterns that work, but also being willing to break and adjust those patterns from time to time.
Because people change over time, and so you need to change those patterns as well sometimes, or maybe often, right?
So I guess I'll just follow up with saying that this holds true for animals as well. And one thing that we see, especially in the titi monkeys, is that once pairs have babies, so they're parents, then the pair bond, the parents spend less time reinforcing that pair bond. So maybe for all the parents out there, you can step away and find a babysitter for the night and go do something new, like Paul said.
That's really great advice. Well, this has been a really great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's been great. Thanks.
Paul Eastwick is a professor of psychology and runs the Attraction and Relationships Research Laboratory at UC Davis. And Karen Bales is professor of psychology at UC Davis as well, also core scientist in the Neuroscience and Behavior Unit at the California National Primate Research Center. If you'd like to hear more about the science of relationships, check out my discussion with Paul Eastwick on the Backdrop podcast, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts, and at ucdavis.edu/podcast. On the next UC Davis Live, we'll be talking about a UC Davis professor's social justice version of the game Monopoly coming back to light after 50 years. I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live.